Hello everyone, I'm Sanjana and I have Yaagneshwaran with me today. Yaag, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, such a pleasure, Sanjana. Thank you for having me on your show. Always been a huge fan of the things that you've been doing on the product marketing side of the world, and pleasure to be
Thank
with
you
you
so
here today.
much. Thank you. That's really motivating to hear. So Yaag is currently the director of content marketing at Avoma, and he's also a well-established marketing author and a podcast host. So today, Yaag and I we're going to discuss about podcast marketing and its future. So before we start, Yaag, can you tell us a little bit about your background? Like, where did you start your career, and where are you now?
Yeah. So I graduated after my MBA in 2009. And so the way I started was I had actually gotten an appointment with a company called MFC in Dubai, and things got called off because of recession back in the day, and I
Yeah.
didn't know what to do. And so I decided to start my own marketing agency, ran it for about a couple of years, and then really miserably failed on a lot of things, but had a lot of learning in that journey. And from there on, somewhere around 2011, I started working for SaaS companies. And slowly over a period of time, I've enjoyed learning the different parts of the game, like product marketing, content marketing, explored podcasts on the way, got to write a few books, speak at a few events, and fortunate enough to have a lot of great relationships on the way whom I've learned from. And today, I'm here with you. I mean, you're part of the Chennai marketing community as well, so which is fantastic. And it's great to be among people like us here together, where we get to learn from each other and consistently be inspiring to each other if we can.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing your journey with us. So let's get into the topic. So I recently read that HubSpot mentioned in one of their articles that people are shutting down podcasts because they're not able to prove ROI. Is that true? Like, I want to get your take on it.
Yeah. No, that's I did see that too. And to me, it's pretty interesting because one of the things I strongly feel about podcasts is that it is not about not being able to prove the ROI, but it is being able to look at what exactly is ROI for a podcast. How do you
Exactly.
define
Yeah.
ROI? Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I mean by that is, for example, if you're thinking that, hey, I'm going to do about say 3 or 4 episodes of podcast and then immediately expect a lot of people to sign up for my product and directly attribute that to revenue, it's really not going to happen. And in fact, I've also been doing a lot of research over the last few months, specifically in the area of podcast advertising, and that's even more stressful to prove as an ROI, because majority of the people that I've spoken to have always said that, hey, podcast advertising majorly is more about getting your brand in front of people, and more and more people getting to know your story, what you stand for, who you are, and establishing it in front of your relevant audience. So I would attribute podcasting more like a combination of say your brand awareness, brand play, plus demand gen. When I say demand gen, I'm specifically talking about trying to be on top of mind of people over a period of time, and say the moment say somebody is thinking of say a conversation intelligence solution, I want them to think of Avoma rather than anybody else, and that's the journey that one needs to try to build through podcasts. And this is a space where you can look at putting forth your point of view. Gone are the days where people used to have traditional PR firms for their companies who were publishing one or two say article pieces in some magazine which nobody really reads, right? And
Yeah.
at the end of the day, it probably might help you get verified blue tick on Twitter or Facebook or somewhere, but does it really help? No. And podcast is a platform where you can put forth your point of view, how you think as a company. Or maybe I will even put it this way, when you look at a piece of content, and if I can cover my hands on the heading and
Hmm.
some parts of the content where it talks about the brand name, and if I can read 4 or 5 lines and say that, hey, this sounds like a point of view of Avoma, then maybe you have established something. And for that, I think a podcast can be a great space for you to do. So to me, uh, I would say that you define ROI a little differently. If you're going to look at it in a very transactional manner, I think that's probably not the right way to go.
Yeah, and should I keep looking forward to signups from podcast? Like, what do you actually measure? Is that a branding channel, or should I look forward to signups every month?
So signups can happen. So there are multiple ways to look at it. One is like, say, when you look at signups from a podcast, you can sometimes have a page. You can say that, hey, you can come to Avoma slash modern SaaS podcast or something like that. And I say, hey, come to this page. It could be a simple URL that I can spell out in my ad, and then people could come to that
Mm,
place. And but in reality, what happens is, say 10,000 people are listening to this episode, and
yeah.
probably about 10 people have gone on to take that effort to type it out and go to my page, and maybe one person fills up a form. Now, if I'm going to measure and say that only one person has seen this, that's a very wrong attribution. So I would say it is not about measuring signups from that page, but rather, use that a little differently. Maybe look at it as a self-attributed source. Maybe every time your AE or an SDR goes on a conversation for an inbound lead that comes into your system and says, hey, how did you get to know about us? And if somebody says, hey, I heard you on a podcast, it can be your own podcast, it can be
Yeah.
an external podcast where you were a guest on, and I heard that part, that was really interesting, that's how I came here. So that attribution, so I would say, don't look at attribution right from the beginning, but
Okay.
this can happen in retrospect. I can say that, hey, in the last 1 month, probably 7 or 8 massive opportunities have come through podcasts. That
Mm,
means podcast has really influenced me. So that's how
yeah.
you look at it, and then you decide that, okay, how do I invest on this? Do I advertise on podcasts? Do I go as a guest, or do I produce more episodes of mine? Do I bring in customers to share their point of view? Do I bring in industry leaders? So all of those things can come up based on how things are working for you. But
Okay.
fundamentally, you start with a basic strategy saying that this is what I want to do, this is what my goal is, this is who my customers are, and so these are the kind of things that already exist in the market. So I need to do something unique that sounds like me, so that people identify me for that. So there are a lot of components that work together here.
Yeah. Yeah. Should you do all of it, or should you just take one approach and do that well?
Yeah, so you can start with a couple of them to begin with. So one of the things that I very strongly believe in is that never have plans for a long period of time. In the sense, like, never say that I will accomplish this in a quarter. Probably say that
Okay.
I'll try to do these 5 set of things in a week or a couple of weeks. The moment you plan for quarters and months, it's never going to happen, or it's going to take a long time. So you
Mm,
quickly experiment a few things, and but stay consistent with it for quite a period of time. At least with podcasts, I would say, 3 or 4 episodes is not going to give you any measure of how it has
yeah.
panned out. You need to be in this game for at least probably 6 months to 1 year to understand how things are impacting. And I'm pretty confident that as long as you are offering something valuable. For example, until a few months back, I had my own ABM
Yeah.
Conversations podcast. I've done about like 150 episodes of that, and I never really directly made any revenue out of it in terms of, say, yeah, I did have a couple of sponsors over a period of time, but what I would say is, for me, the way I looked at it was it helped me establish my story. Like, say, for example, my CEO at Avoma came to know of me because he had heard that podcast a few times and he liked my points of view.
Nice.
And we found that there was an alignment between the way I think and the way he thinks. There were value systems matches. So it depends on what goal you have, and it depends on how you want to communicate with that. So yeah, I keep bringing back to the same aspect, saying that experiment it in quick sprints, but
Mm,
stay consistent with it for long periods of time, and make sure that you're not looking at it in a very transactional manner.
got it. Got it. And should every brand have a podcast of their own? It's already a crowded market now. Like, if they should have a podcast, then how do they stand out from the crowd?
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're starting a podcast because every other company is having a podcast, that's probably not the best reason to start. So see, it is more about how you look at it. And when you say, how do I stand out? it's fundamentally starting with who you are and how you are different. You cannot manufacture differentiation on the go. It needs to be something that is inherent. Like, say for example, um, in the conversation intelligence space, there are about say 6 or 7 key players. There are many, but I'm saying 6 or 7
Yeah.
key players. So when you look at it, one of the things I realized even much before joining Avoma is that, hey, there are a lot of these companies talking about it only from the perspective of sales coaching or
Mm.
maybe just revenue intelligence. And then I realized that Avoma had a much broader point of view. We looked at it and said, it's not just this, that's more than that. Every meeting has a life cycle, things you do before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. So it's a meeting life cycle assistant, which also has components of, conversation intelligence, revenue intelligence, note taking, and all of that. And see, the thing is, when people think of targeting a particular audience, they think that they should solve for one problem. So let
Mm.
me maybe give you a content marketing style of example. Let's say you realize that your audience is, say, sales development folks or business development folks who's using your product for sales intelligence. They
Okay.
are probably using your lead feeder to understand, hey, this is who are visiting my website, and these are the pages they visited, and then let me plan how to reach out to them and do a set of things to engage them. Now, that's one perspective. But what is really, really important is that once you have these people come into your website and start engaging with you, you need to think of that as a holistic workflow. In a sense, what am I communicating with them? And what do these readers do after they read content on a particular page? Um, most companies generally, if you go to their blogs, you see that they have a series of social sharing buttons.
Yeah,
In
yeah,
reality, you know um, let's ask ourselves, when was the last time we went about sharing from a company's,
yeah. Mm.
when did you share a company's blog post the last time? Not really. But
Yeah.
what people really do is that if they like something and if they feel that some of their team members can learn from that, they probably share that blog post in their Slack channel or something
Mm.
internally. So once I spoke to a lot of these customers, I understood that that's their workflow. And then I
Okay.
added a small button saying that, hey, are you finding this useful? Do you want to share it with your team? Copy the URL. It could be
Okay.
something very simple. So yeah, the reason why I'm giving you this example is that your unique point of view comes from understanding who your audience is, what they do before, during, and after the entire life
Mm.
cycle, and what is the different point of view that you want to educate to the industry, and position that in that category, rather than saying that, hey, this is what the entire spectrum looks like and how do I fit in. Instead of you fitting in, you start to look at how do you educate your market. And especially, podcast is really useful from the point of view that you cannot sometimes outspend your competitors when you're starting out, right?
Mm.
So at this
Exactly.
stage,
Yeah.
I would, yeah. So at that point, you can always out educate your competition. You can
Mm.
make sure that I can do these 10 different things to educate. And podcast is one of those components. It's not the only component, it's one of those components. So generally, even when it comes to podcast content or say podcast advertisement, what people do is they move their budget from some other channel which was not working into this. So you're already trying to move things, you're not freshly putting into it. But this, you can be sure that when you do something consistently over a period of time, you will build an audience. So the goal here is to build an audience, and it's like consistently creating a brand for yourself, voice for yourself on LinkedIn. You keep posting content on a daily basis, and now if somebody asks you what is the ROI of it, maybe you got a job. Maybe somebody read some of your content and came back to you and then decided to buy your product. Or somebody said, hey Sanjana, can you connect me with somebody in your team? I would like to have a demo of your product. It could be any of those things, but you never know what the outcome is. But you are one of those channels to put out those voice and points of view and establish your presence to be in a particular way.
All right. And speaking of being the voice of the podcast, Who do you think should take the ownership of running a podcast in a company? Should it be the marketing team or should it be the CEO? Because if it's the marketing team, they're going to leave the company one day. So, like, who should own that, the voice of the company?
Right. So generally, the voice of the brand usually is something. See, it doesn't matter who runs the podcast.
Okay.
It's not about like say today Dave Gerhardt runs a podcast on certain topics with Drift, and then he leaves. Then the podcast doesn't die. So that is why it is very important for us to think about it from the brand voice and not the person's voice point of view.
Yeah.
Um, so, like, say, for example, anybody who is the face of the podcast needs to be so aligned with the brand's voice so that that's
Okay.
the voice that's communicated. For example, in Avoma, the way we think is we have the entire leadership team aligned on the kind of messaging that we want to have, or the kind of brand that we want to be, and the we have an Avoma way of doing things. So now, because I'm hosting the podcast, I can communicate things because I'm part of that group. Now,
Yeah.
tomorrow, if my VP of marketing takes up hosting the podcast, it'll still be the same. It's not that this person is being missed and it's completely lost. So you never
Okay.
build something around a person. You build it around a brand, but the brand needs to have a set of faces to make it more realistic. In the sense, you need to have your CEO, you need to have somebody who like it can be your VP of customer success, VP of sales, depending on what your story is, and bring those kind of personas who can bring practical point of views there.
Awesome. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good one. And like, what do you think is the reason why a lot of businesses fail in running a podcast? Like we see every business now runs a podcast, but not everyone are successful. What do you
Yeah.
think is the reason behind that?
Um, I'm not sure about every single company, but broadly, if I have to list out a few things that I've commonly noticed, is number one is lack of consistency. Number two is not having the right expectations. And number three is not having a clear strategy for your podcast.
Okay.
So let me explain each of these things. So first, when you say not being consistent, it's like if you're doing one show a month
Mm.
or like whenever you can, that's not going to work out. Like if you have a point of view, if you have a story, and if you stand for something, people need to be consistently hearing you. It's like many times as a marketer, we tend to think that, hey, I've already discussed this story in these places, but nobody remembers apart from us,
Exactly. Yeah.
right?
Good
So
point. Yes.
yeah, so it's important to harp on your story in different formats, in different ways, and with different say contexts to get that story out. Second, I'm also talking about, say, let's make sure that there is some amount of clarity in terms of why we are doing this, what direction we are going. So when we have that sort of a direction, you will not be short-sighted about the podcast. Your expectations with the podcast is right, that
Mm.
hey, this is a long-term messaging channel. This is not a campaign, but this is a representation of who we are. So that's a whole game changer. The moment you start doing that, you will not look at it as running some Facebook ads or Google ads, but rather look at this as a channel for establishing your story out there. So it becomes as close to product marketing. At the same time, it's somewhere it starts to be an intersection of your product marketing, brand marketing, and being the narrative that you establish as an organization. And finally, it's about making sure that you have a strategy in sense like what are the different kinds of topics that you're going to cover. Now, I cannot talk about every damn topic on earth. It needs to be relevant to my target audience, and it need not always be around my product. It can
Mm.
be around the set of problems that these people face, or it can be about, say, a kind of thought leadership saying that, hey, this is the direction where we are going, or it can be discussion of a specific use case saying that this is how you go about solving something. So it can be a number of things, but you need to have some amount of pillars saying that this is my audience, these are the different things that they care for, and then that pillar needs to be broken down into specific statements saying that how do I express it? Now, say for example, if I'm going to talk about certain characteristics, like if I'm going to say that my brand also has a feeling of being curious, now how do I express that curiosity, right? So I can discuss topics that I might have a point of view about, but I might not have a clear answer. So I might say that, hey, this is how we as a company think. What do you feel about it? To make it more interactive. So I'll break it down this way. Have pillars. From there, break it down to the problem statements, and then break it down to different ways of expressing it that ties back to the characteristic of your brand, how you are, because it should not sound like somebody else. Say intercom cannot sound like drift cannot sound like
Yeah.
freshworks, you know. So you still need to maintain that integrity as well. So all these three things need to go together on top of the first two things that I spoke about.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so we have almost reached the end of the episode. So I'll just wrap it up with a few more questions. So is it better to to run a podcast channel, or is it better to have a YouTube channel? Like, which is better, audio or video? Uh, like, which one works well for companies?
So I necessarily don't think that it's an either or. So like say for example, when you're recording a show, you can do both, right? So right now we are recording video as well as audio, and this it depends how you want to use it. So for example, when I record a podcast on video, there are three things that happen. One, the podcast out finally after editing comes out in a wave format, which is audio, which gets distributed on
Okay.
all podcasting platforms like your Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all of that. So people who want to listen audio, they will listen audio. And then, of course, it also goes on YouTube and other video channels as well. And because you're recording video, it also helps you to cut down into small snippets of information which becomes socially shareable. So I wouldn't say it's more to do with the format, but
Okay.
it's more to do with the way you can think about this as content repurposing. What are the different ways that you want to use an episode? And maybe you can even use this as part of your blog post. Sometimes
Yeah.
we tend to pick up some very interesting podcast episodes and convert it into a blog because it becomes a strong opinion piece of
Mm.
a certain topic. Yeah.
All right. All right. So I just have one last question before I let you go. So can you make money out of podcast? Uh, what
Yeah,
sort
go ahead.
of yeah, like what sort of things that you need to do to make money out of podcast?
Right. So depends on how you look at it again. Maybe I'm saying a lot of depends like a typical marketer. But what I mean by that is, say when you're an individual podcaster,
Yeah.
um the scope for making money is in a few formats. Like say for example, you could either have sponsors for your show,
Mhm.
or so which means like but for that your podcast needs to be at a certain level, in the sense like you need to have x number of listeners. Like say if you
Okay.
have 100K listeners per month, because at the end of the day, when you invest on a podcast, when you advertise on a podcast, you're going to see that is the audience relevant to me,
Yeah.
how many people are listening to that episode, and then okay, out of that, what has been the past response rate like? Now when you typically get these kind of rate cards from podcasters, these are just usually download numbers. But
Mm.
one of the things that is an issue today with podcasts is that it's very tough to measure the intent of a listener and the kind of action that they're taking out of the podcast. In sense, like I could listen to your podcast and then I could go on and check out Lead Feeder, and then I might end up signing up for it. But you don't know unless you're asking me that question where I came from.
Okay.
So it becomes difficult for people to invest on podcast unless they see it as a long term game. So that's one ROI aspect, in sense like, can you make money? Absolutely. In the sense, this is one. But when you look at it from a brand perspective, it is a massive demand gen tool. So when you go back and look at the same ROI story, you can say that, hey, in the last 1 month, I got 8 people who signed up for my product. And they became my customers, they could probably, each of them could cost roughly 20K to 50K or whatever the ticket size is. And you could say that that's the money that you made out of the podcast. So it depends if you're looking at it from an sponsor standpoint. If you're looking at it, or there are also certain companies, the way they look at podcast, say ROI generation, or even monetizing the podcast is, they even, if you are a huge podcast, you can even
Okay.
start, say for example, you can say, if you want to be a guest on my podcast, it costs so much. But generally that is, to me, I don't like that a lot, in the sense, because it becomes more of a PR channel than becoming a source that can be trusted, right? So
Yeah.
I don't want to be on a show just to put out a message by paying say $2,000 or $3,000, but rather it makes more sense for me to run an ad or maybe have my own show. At the end of the day, I would always say that every company needs to have their own set of media channels than depending that for outside, and podcasting is a big one for that.
All right, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you so much for spending your time with me, Yaag. We have reached the end of the episode. Just one last question. Like, do you have any advice to give it out for our listeners today? It could be anything. It could be about career, or it could be about life, anything.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just say two things. One is, always be curious. uh, Being, you might not have answers for everything, but if you stay with the question long enough, you will find different sources where you can find answers, or people where you can find answers. So as they say, in the Indian tradition, that if a student is ready, the guru appears, or the answer appears. So that's what curiosity is all about. And second thing I would leave with is, don't take yourself too seriously.
Very nice, very nice. That's a good piece of advice. Thank you so much, Yaag. Thank you for your time. I absolutely loved your energy and enthusiasm throughout the conversation. I'll give you a LinkedIn link in the description so people can connect with you later if they want to learn more about, podcast marketing. So
Yeah.
thank you so much and see you
Thank you
again.
so much. Thanks for having me. It was such a pleasure, and always happy to be on your show anytime.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye bye.